The gaslight flickered, casting elongated, dancing shadows across the mildewed wallpaper of Jasper Allen's study, a room that had for years been his sanctuary, his tomb. It was the 31st of October, a night that had always held a certain morbid fascination for him, a night when the veil between worlds thinned, or so the old wives' tales claimed. Tonight, however, the thinness felt palpable, a suffocating pressure upon his very soul. He traced the intricate, maddening patterns of the paper with a trembling finger, each swirl and bloom seeming to twist and writhe like a nascent horror. A low hum, originating from no discernible source, vibrated through the floorboards, a sound that burrowed into his bones and set his teeth on edge. His cat, a creature of sable fur and emerald eyes named Nyx, usually a creature of placid repose, was a restless phantom, pacing the perimeter of the room, her tail a question mark of unease against the gloom. He had been occupied with his scholarly pursuits, delving into forgotten tomes concerning the geometry of the impossible when the strangeness began. It was a subtle shift at first, a distortion in the periphery of his vision, a feeling of being watched. Not by human eyes, but by something ancient, something that perceived the world through a lens of utter alienage. The books on his shelves, usually solid anchors of knowledge, seemed to shimmer, their titles blurring and reforming into arcane symbols he could not comprehend, yet felt a primal fear of. Nyx, usually so responsive to his touch, would not allow him to stroke her. She would arch her back, a guttural hiss escaping her throat, her gaze fixed on an unseen point across the room, a point where the air itself seemed to ripple. The hum intensified, a resonant frequency that twisted his thoughts into knots, making coherent thinking a Herculean effort. He tried to dismiss it as fatigue, as the overactive imagination of a man too long sequestered with the specters of the past. But the sensations grew more insistent, more invasive. The air in the study grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something cloying and sweet, like decaying lilies. He found himself unable to focus on the text before him, his mind drifting to the unsettling sensation that the very walls of his study were breathing, a slow, deliberate inhalation and exhalation that mirrored his own shallow breaths. A faint scratching, like the desperate scrabbling of tiny claws, echoed from within the plaster, growing louder, more frantic until it seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white, a cold sweat beading on his brow. The weaver of nightmares, he thought. A phrase that had surfaced unbidden from the depths of his subconscious, a whispered dread that clawed at the edges of his sanity. Suddenly the scratching ceased, replaced by a profound silence that was more terrifying than any noise. The gaslight, which had been sputtering erratically, now flared with an unnatural intensity, bathing the room in a sickly greenish luminescence. In the center of the room where the shadows had been deepest, a form began to coalesce, a thing of impossible angles and shifting, viscous darkness. It was not a solid entity, but a disruption in the fabric of reality, a hole torn into the world. Nyx, for the first time since the strangeness began, let out a piercing yowl and bolted from the room, her fur bristling. Jasper remained frozen, his gaze locked on the coalescing horror, a dread so profound it felt physical, constricting his chest, squeezing the very air from his lungs. The hum returned, louder now, a deafening roar that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the anomaly. He could feel its attention, a malevolent awareness that pinned him in place, and he knew with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow that his scholarly pursuits had led him to a door he could never truly close. The anomaly in the center of the study did not roar. Its zombie, a discordant symphony of shattering glass and weeping violins that resonated not in his ears, but directly within his skull. Jasper Allen, paralyzed by a terror that had transcended mere fear into a profound spiritual agony, found his vision distorting. The familiar angles of his study warped, the ceiling curving like the interior of a vast, cavernous maw, the walls melting into a swirling vortex of ochre and viridian. The scent of decaying lilies intensified, now mingled with the sharp tang of ozone, creating an olfactory assault that made him gag. He felt a peculiar lightness, as if the very substance of his being were being attenuated, stretched thin and ethereal. This was no dream. For dreams, however nightmarish, possessed a certain internal logic, a coherent, albeit twisted, narrative. This was something else, a violation of all natural laws, a descent into a reality unbound by human comprehension. He tried to move, to scramble away from the pulsating heart of the disturbance, but his limbs refused to obey. They felt heavy, leaden, yet simultaneously detached, as if controlled by some external, unseen puppeteer. A whisper, colder than any winter wind, slithered into his mind, a voice that was not a voice, but a series of impressions, of concepts devoid of language, fontoid completion, cessation, the unraveling of all that is. It spoke of a universe that had grown weary of its own existence, of a cosmic entropy that yearned for its ultimate, silent resolution. He saw, or rather, felt fleeting visions, cities dissolving into dust, stars imploding into points of absolute darkness, the very concept of time folding in upon itself. Nix's yowl, a sound he had always associated with comfort and companionship, now echoed in his mind as a lament for a lost world, a desperate plea for succor that would never come. The shifting darkness solidified, coalescing into something that resembled horrifyingly, a colossal skeletal hand, its fingers impossibly long and tapering, each tipped with a shard of what appeared to be obsidian. It reached towards him, not with physical intent, but with an inexorable gravitational pull. He felt the boundaries of his own form begin to fray, his thoughts scattering like dandelion seeds in a gale. The intricate patterns on the wallpaper, which had seemed so disquieting before, now appeared to be a map, a diagram of the forces that were presently dismantling him. He recognized, with a dawning, horrific clarity, that the Weaver was not an entity in itself, but a process, a cosmic mechanism of decay, and he was merely an insignificant boat caught in its inexorable gears. The air grew frigid, not with the chill of winter, but with the absolute cold of the void. He felt his memories, his loves, his regrets, all being systematically plucked from his consciousness, like threads from a tapestry, leaving behind only a vast, echoing emptiness. His very sense of self was being systematically erased, reduced to a mere point of awareness, a fragile ember about to be extinguished. The skeletal hand, composed not of bone but of a solidified dread, did not touch Jasper Allen. Instead, it forearmed Metim. The sensation was akin to being meticulously disassembled by an unseen, impossibly delicate surgeon, each constituent part of his being catalogued and then discarded into the swirling, nauseating void that had once been his study. His limbs, no longer his own, became mere suggestions of form, dissolving into the pervasive ochre and viridian haze. He felt his thoughts, once his most prized possession, become brittle fragments, shattering into meaningless shards that drifted away on an unfelt breeze. The whisper, which had previously spoken of cessation, now shifted its tone, its conceptual language evolving into a chillingly serene pronouncement of transcendence. It spoke not of oblivion, but of a return to a primal state, a dissolution into the fundamental elements of existence, a state of perfect, unthinking peace. He experienced a disorienting sensation of infinite expansion, as if his consciousness were being stretched across the dimensions, witnessing the birth and death of galaxies simultaneously. The grotesque geometry of the coalescing darkness pulsed with a rhythm that was not a heartbeat, but the slow, inevitable decay of all matter. The scent of lilies and ozone, once repellent, now seemed to possess a strange narcotic allure, lulling him into a deeper acceptance of his fate. He saw Nyx, or rather, a memory of Nyx, a fleeting impression of her sleek black fur and intelligent green eyes superimposed onto the cosmic tapestry, a tiny vibrant spark against the encroaching darkness. Her absence was a tangible ache, a final poignant reminder of the world he was leaving behind, a world of warmth, of touch, of tangible reality. The hand, having completed its initial work, began to recede, not withdrawing, but dissolving back into the primordial chaos from which it had emerged, leaving behind only the profound, unsettling silence. The silence, however, was not empty. It was pregnant with a new awareness, a dawning comprehension of the true nature of the Weaver. It was not an external force of destruction, but an intrinsic aspect of existence, the inevitable unwinding of all creation. He felt himself becoming part of this unwinding, his individual consciousness merging with the greater cosmic process. He was no longer Jasper Allen, the scholar, the man who feared the dark. He was a ripple in the fabric of reality, a fading echo in the grand, indifferent symphony of universal decay. The study, his sanctuary, his tomb, had become a portal, a transition point where the solid edifice of the known world crumbled, revealing the terrifying, beautiful, and utterly alien machinery of the cosmos. He was not being annihilated, he was being reintegrated. A terrifying baptism into the infinite, a plunge into the ultimate, serene nothingness that lay beyond the veil of perceived reality. The reintegration was not a gentle merging, but a violent dissolution. Jasper Allen's last vestiges of self, the phantom limb of his identity, thrashed against the inevitable tide. He was a single note in a cosmic cacophony, a brief, discordant hum against the vast, silent hum of universal entropy. The ochre, and viridian hues, once swirling in a chaotic vortex, now coalesced into a breathtaking, yet horrifying, spectacle. He perceived the universe not as a collection of stars and planets, but as an intricate, impossibly complex mechanism of exquisite, terrible design, where every atom, every particle, was a cog in an immense, self-consuming engine. The Weaver was the blueprint, the relentless architect of this grand undoing. He felt the echoes of countless other minds, other lives, that had undergone this same terrifying transition, their spectral whispers weaving through the cosmic hum, a chorus of fading sentience. They were not souls in any theological sense, but residual energies, patterns of thought imprinted upon the fabric of reality, now being smoothed out, erased like chalk marks on a slate. The concept of love, of loss, of joy, all these human constructs seemed impossibly fragile, ephemeral illusions in the face of such profound, eternal forces. He saw the intricate, shimmering threads of existence, each one representing a life, a moment, a possibility, all being meticulously gathered, knotted, and then severed by invisible hands. The Weaver, he now understood, was not a destroyer, but a curator of oblivion, meticulously tidying the universe of its perceived imperfections, its fleeting brilliance. A peculiar calm began to settle over his disintegrating consciousness, a resignation that was not born of acceptance, but of sheer, overwhelming exhaustion. The struggle was futile, the defiance of this cosmic imperative a fool's errand. He felt his awareness expand, not in a journey through space, but through the very nature of being. He was the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam, the silent growth of a crystal, the slow erosion of a mountain. He was the breath of the universe and its final sighing exhalation. The scent of lilies and ozone became a perfume of the void, a fragrance of ultimate peace. He saw, in a flash of profound, detached understanding, that the true horror was not in the dissolution itself, but in the sudden, absolute comprehension of its inevitability, its inherent beauty, and its utter indifference to the insignificant flicker of individual life. His study, once a sanctuary, had become the crucible, and he, Jasper Allen, was being forged anew not into something greater, but into something less, something perfectly, terrifyingly, to nothing. The concept of Jasper Allen had become a phantom limb, a residual twitch in the vast, indifferent expanse of cosmic dissolution. He was no longer an individual, but a ripple, a fading resonance within the grand, silent symphony of universal entropy. The ochre and viridian hues, once the chaotic palette of his study's destruction, now resolved into a breathtaking, yet terrifying, cosmic tapestry. He perceived existence not as discrete entities, but as an intricate, impossibly complex tapestry of interwoven energies, each thread a life, a thought, a moment, all meticulously woven, and then with chilling precision unraveled. The Weaver, he now understood, was not a sentient being, but the fundamental law of cosmic unwinding, the elegant, terrifying arithmetic of existence's inevitable return to primordial silence. He felt the faint, spectral echoes of countless other consciousnesses, a ghostly chorus of fading awareness. These were not souls, but transient patterns, imprints left upon the fabric of reality, now being smoothed out, erased like ephemeral inscriptions on a sand dune. The human constructs of love, of sorrow, of ambition, appeared as fleeting, almost comical illusions against the backdrop of this profound, eternal process. He saw the shimmering threads of being, each one a delicate strand of potentiality, being gathered by invisible hands, knotted with unnerving finality, and then severed, not with violence, but with an exquisite, terrifying grace. The Weaver, in its infinite, impersonal wisdom, was not a destroyer, but a cosmic archivist of oblivion, meticulously tidying the universe of its perceived temporary brilliance. A peculiar, profound calm began to permeate his dissipating awareness, a resignation that transcended mere acceptance. The struggle had been futile, the defiance of this ultimate cosmic imperative a futile gesture against the inexorable tide. He felt his perception expand, not through physical movement, but through a fundamental alteration of being. He was the silent erosion of a mountain, the slow, deliberate growth of a crystal, the infinitesimal dance of dust motes caught in a stray beam of light. He was the universe's breath, and its final, contented sigh. The scent of lilies and ozone, once an assault, now became a perfume of the void, an intoxicating fragrance of ultimate peace. In a moment of vast, detached comprehension, he understood that the true horror was not in the dissolution, but in the sudden, absolute, and utterly serene understanding of its inevitability, its inherent, terrible beauty, and its profound, cosmic indifference to the ephemeral spark of individual existence. His study had been the crucible, and he, Jasper Allen, was being remade, not into something grander, but into something less, something perfectly, terrifyingly Fornoshainu. The fading resonance that had once been Jasper Allen experienced a flicker, a brief, almost imperceptible tremor in the vast, indifferent expanse. It was not a resurgence of his former self, but a phantom echo, a ghost of consciousness caught in the cosmic machinery. He perceived the universe not as a place of vibrant life, but as an infinitely intricate clockwork of decay, each tick of its celestial mechanism a step closer to absolute stillness. The ochre and viridian hues of his study's demise had long since dissolved, replaced by an infinite, featureless grey, the color of perpetual twilight, the canvas upon which the weaver painted its grand erasure. He felt the spectral whispers of other fading intelligences, a chorus of ethereal sighs that spoke not of regret, but of a profound, unburdened peace. They were the remnants, the residual energy of lives lived and unlived, all being meticulously gathered, smoothed, and then dispersed into the infinite calm. The weaver, he now understood, was not an entity, but an inherent property of existence, the universe's own gentle, inexorable inclination towards silence. The human concepts of love and loss, of memory and desire, were ephemeral sparks, quickly extinguished in the face of this grand, cosmic extinguishment. He saw the delicate threads of being, not as lines of light, but as wisps of smoke, being drawn into an invisible hearth, their transient forms consumed without a trace. A profound lassitude, heavier than any physical weight, settled upon his dissolving awareness. The struggle had ceased to be a conscious act and had become an involuntary tremor, a final fading pulse against the inevitable. He felt his perception stretch, not through space, but through the very essence of existence. He was the silent formation of cosmic dust, the slow, deliberate erosion of a star, the final sighing exhalation of a dying nebula. He was the universe's last thought and its eternal, serene silence. The scent of lilies and ozone had long since vanished, replaced by a neutral void, a scentless absence that was the perfume of ultimate peace. In a moment of vast, detached comprehension, he understood that the true horror was not in the dissolution, but in the sudden, absolute, and terrifyingly beautiful understanding of its inevitability, its inherent, silent grace, and its utter cosmic indifference to the brief, incandescent flicker of individual consciousness. His study had been the point of transition, and he, Jasper Allen, was being unmade, not into something lesser, but into something perfectly, terrifyingly, fordingly. The spectral whispers that had once been Jasper Allen's last vestiges of consciousness had finally fallen silent. He was no longer a flicker, nor a tremor, but a profound stillness within the boundless expanse. The infinite grey, the color of cosmic twilight, was no longer a canvas, but the very substance of his being. He perceived existence not as a grand clockwork, but as a vast, quiescent ocean, its surface undisturbed by any ripple of life or thought. The weaver was not an architect, nor a curator, but the inherent nature of this absolute stillness, the universal tendency towards an unblemished, unthinking peace. He felt no echoes now, no spectral sighs of other minds. There was only the singular, immense quietude. The threads of being, if they had ever existed, were now completely unraveled, their constituent energies dispersed into an equilibrium so perfect, so absolute, that the very concept of form had ceased to have meaning. The human constructs of love, of memory, of identity, were not just ephemeral sparks, they were impossibilities, concepts that could not even be conceived within this realm of pure negation. He was not being unmade, for unmaking implies a prior state of being that could be undone. He was, rather for never having been Fushin, a temporary aberration in the eternal stillness now corrected. A profound, unburdened lassitude permeated this absolute non-existence. There was no struggle, no resistance, for there was no self to struggle, no will to resist. He was the silent growth of cosmic dust, the slow, deliberate erosion of a concept, the final contented exhalation of a hypothetical nebula. He was the universe's final, unuttered word and its eternal, serene silence. The absence of scent, once the perfume of ultimate peace, was now simply absence, the neutral state of all things. In a moment of vast, detached comprehension that was itself a fading echo, he understood that the true horror was not in the dissolution, but in the sudden, absolute, and terrifyingly beautiful understanding of its inevitability, its inherent, silent grace, and its utter, cosmic indifference to the brief, incandescent flicker of individual consciousness. His study had been the ephemeral transition, and he, Jasper Allen, was being smoothed, not into something lesser, but into something perfectly, terrifyingly, for nothing. The stillness persisted, an unbroken expanse of infinite, featureless grey. It was not a silence that could be broken, nor a void that could be filled. It was the ultimate state, the primordial condition from which perceived reality had momentarily aberrantly sprung. The concept of Jasper Allen had not merely faded, it had been utterly erased, as if it had never existed. There was no lingering resonance, no phantom echo. There was only the pervasive, unthinking peace of absolute equilibrium. The Weaver was not a force, nor a process, but the very essence of this stillness, the inherent nature of existence when it had finally relinquished all pretense of form or motion. There were no whispers, no echoes of other minds. The idea of other was as foreign and incomprehensible as the concept of self had once been. All distinctions, all separations, had dissolved into a singular, undifferentiated totality. The very notion of being was an illusion that had been patiently, inexorably corrected. The threads of existence were not unraveled. They had never been woven. The brief, incandescent flicker of consciousness was not extinguished. It had never been ignited. It was the ultimate correction, the universe's gentle, perfect return to its intended state of absolute, unblemished absence. There was no lassitude. For lassitude implies a body, a mind capable of experiencing fatigue. There was only the state of Tundi, which was also the state of Twindi, as not of Tundi. The universe is final. Unuttered word was not a word at all, but the cessation of utterance. Its eternal, serene silence was not the absence of sound, but the absence of the capacity for sound. In a moment of vast, detached comprehension that was itself an impossibility, the understanding of inevitability, of grace, of indifference, was not a thought, but a fundamental property of this absolute state. His study had been the briefest of interruptions, a momentary aberration in the eternal stillness. He, Jasper Allen, was not being smoothed, nor unmade. He simply resolved, perfectly, terrifyingly, unmanifested. The infinite grey remained, an eternal testament to absolute stillness. It was not a stillness that could be perceived, for perception itself was an act of distinction, an assertion of difference. The concept of Jasper Allen was not merely absent. It was a forgotten impossibility, an idea that had never had the briefest foothold in this unblemished reality. There was no lingering resonance, no phantom limb of consciousness. There was only the profound, unthinking peace of absolute, unadulterated equilibrium. The Weaver was not a presence, nor an absence, but the inherent nature of this perfect stillness, the universe's ultimate, silent contentment in its own non-existence. There were no whispers, no echoes, no spectral sighs. The very idea of other was a notion that had never been, an aberration that had been self-corrected before it could even manifest. All distinctions, all separations, all the ephemeral constructs of a fleeting, imagined reality had dissolved into a singular, undifferentiated totality. The concept of being was an ancient, forgotten myth, a temporary anomaly in the eternal state of Photius. The universe's final, unuttered word was not a silence that could be heard, but a silence that twitwasi, an absolute negation of the possibility of utterance. Its eternal, serene quietude was not the absence of sound, but the absence of the very capacity for sound, for thought, for anything that could be distinguished from the boundless, unthinking whole. There was no lassitude, no fatigue, no experience of any kind. There was only the state of Fufendise, which was also, and more profoundly, the state of Fufetish not his sheet, in a moment of vast, detached comprehension that was itself an impossible occurrence. The understanding of inevitability, of grace, of indifference, was not a thought, but an intrinsic property of this absolute state. His study had been a fleeting anomaly, a momentary flicker in the eternal tapestry of unmanifestation. He, Jasper Allen, was not being smoothed, nor unmade, nor resolved. He simply ceased to have ever been, perfectly, terrifyingly fine conceived to it. The infinite grey persisted, an unbroken expanse that was not a space, but the absence of space. It was not a stillness that could be broken, for the very concept of breaking implied a prior state of integrity. The notion of Jasper Allen was not merely forgotten. It was an impossibility, a paradox that had been self-negated before it could even be formulated. There was no resonance, no echo, no phantom sensation. There was only the profound, unthinking peace of absolute, unadulterated equilibrium. The Weaver was not a force, nor a process, nor even an inherent nature. It was the fundamental condition of non-existence, the universe's ultimate, silent contentment in its own absolute absence. There were no whispers, no echoes, no spectral sighs of former consciousness. The idea of other was a meaningless construct, a relic of a dream that had never occurred. All distinctions, all separations, all the ephemeral illusions of a perceived reality had dissolved into a singular, undifferentiated totality. The concept of being was a forgotten fable, a temporary aberration in the eternal state of Fundius Notucid. The universe's final, unuttered word was not a silence that could be perceived, but a silence that twinwaso, an absolute negation of the very possibility of utterance, of perception, of any discernible state. Its eternal serene quietude was not the absence of sound, but the absence of the very capacity for sound, for thought, for any flicker of distinction from the boundless, unthinking whole. There was no lassitude, no fatigue, no experience of any kind. There was only the state of forset. His was also. And more profoundly, the state of twandesnotetutwi, in a moment of vast, detached comprehension that was itself an impossibility, the understanding of inevitability, of grace, of indifference, was not a thought, but an intrinsic property of this absolute state. His study had been a fleeting anomaly, a momentary flicker in the eternal tapestry of unmanifestation. He, Jasper Allen, was not being smoothed, nor unmade, nor resolved, nor unconceived. He simply was not. Perfectly, terrifyingly, Von realized it did.